December 8, 1941. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto remained motionless at his desk, his expression neutral, betraying none of the unease quietly gnawing at him. Around him, staff officers spoke in excited tones, congratulating each other on the perceived triumph of the morning's assault. Outside the windows, celebrations were underway, officers drinking in what they assumed was a decisive blow, yet Yamamoto's mind was elsewhere. Having spent years in the United States, he had witnessed firsthand the staggering scale of American industry, the sprawling automobile factories of Detroit, the endless oil fields of Texas, and he understood the implications of what Japan had just set in motion. Half a year prior, he had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe with unflinching realism, "We can sustain strong resistance for 6 months, but beyond that I cannot predict the outcome if the war drags on for 2 or 3 years." The strike on Pearl Harbor had achieved remarkable tactical success. 8 battleships were either sunk or heavily damaged and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, yet the critical American aircraft carriers had evaded destruction. More significantly, the attack united a fragmented American public, hardening their resolve for total war. The trajectory of defeat for Japan was already being written in numbers, logistics, and capacity. Yamamoto recognized this reality. Many of his peers did not. What the Japanese High Command could not anticipate was the extraordinary industrial surge that Pearl Harbor would provoke. The United States would mobilize resources and labor in a scale unprecedented in human history. Japan's planners, despite their intelligence, calculations, and cautious instincts, could not grasp the true magnitude of this economic and military awakening until it was too late. The foundations of Japanese strategic assumptions were already crumbling. The American industrial engine would not merely overpower Japan militarily, it would shatter the Japanese command's beliefs about war, power, and the limits of their own ambitions. The seeds of disaster had been sown through a perilous mixture of overreach and misjudgment. During the 1932, Japan pursued territorial expansion with the goal of securing raw materials and space for its growing population. The 1931 occupation of Manchuria, the full-scale conflict with China beginning in 1937, and the 1940 takeover of French Indochina all reflected Tokyo's determination to construct a largely self-sufficient empire. Japanese military planners were acutely aware of the vast imbalance between Japan's industrial potential and that of the United States, and this understanding underpinned their strategic planning. The numerical realities were stark. By 1937, Japan accounted for roughly 5% of global industrial output, a figure comparable to France and about half the capacity of either Great Britain or the Soviet Union. In contrast, the United States commanded almost 42% of worldwide industrial production. Even at the depths of the Great Depression, American capacity to produce war material exceeded Japan's by 7 to 10 times. These facts were known, studied, and debated among Japan's military elite, yet they proceeded regardless. The Japanese strategy rested on a critical assumption. Initial victories, beginning with Pearl Harbor, would create a momentum that Japan could exploit through rapid, successive campaigns. This gamble relied entirely on the expectation that the shock of the early attacks would yield long-term strategic leverage. As history would soon reveal, that calculation underestimated the depth, resilience, and productivity of the United States, setting the stage for Japan's eventual and irreversible strategic collapse. Japan's strategy at the dawn of the Pacific conflict was audacious yet rooted in a form of calculated desperation. The plan called for a sudden, decisive strike against the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, while simultaneously securing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Japanese planners envisioned that a rapid series of victories would create a defensive network so extensive and heavily fortified that the United States would hesitate to undertake a costly effort to reclaim it. Their calculations rested entirely on the belief that America would be unwilling or unable to engage in a prolonged total war. This fundamental assumption would later emerge as one of Japan's most critical misjudgments in the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese military leadership underestimated the resilience, industrial capacity, and national determination of their opponent, projecting their own limitations onto a nation operating under vastly different economic and logistical conditions. Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's naval architect for the conflict, was one of the few voices to fully grasp the magnitude of what they faced. He had spent significant time in the United States, first as a Harvard student from 1919 to 1921, and later as a naval attaché in Washington between 1926 and 1928. During these years, Yamamoto traveled widely, observing firsthand the industrial and economic might of the country. He saw the massive automobile factories in Detroit where production lines churned out cars at a pace incomprehensible to Japanese industry. He witnessed Texas oil fields producing quantities of crude that dwarfed Japan's entire petroleum output. He noted the seemingly effortless abundance of American civilian life, the scale of its agriculture, and the continent-spanning infrastructure that underpinned it all. Yamamoto's intimate understanding of these realities made him wary of conflict with the United States. He concluded that Japan lacked the resources to compete in a sustained naval war with an industrial giant such as America. This caution placed him in a politically precarious position, and to shield him from internal assassination plots by aggressive army factions, he was reassigned to command the combined fleet. Once charged with preparing for war against the United States, Yamamoto devised the Pearl Harbor operation as a means to achieve the rapid, crippling victory that Japan required to have any hope of success. Yet, despite his doubts, these warnings were not fully communicated to the broader government, and strategy proceeded largely on the basis of hope rather than rigorous planning. The opening months of hostilities seemed to vindicate Japanese confidence. The initial campaigns unfolded with astonishing speed. Almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck across American, British, and Dutch territories in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma all fell within weeks, often encountering only limited resistance. By March 1942, Japan had established a sprawling empire stretching from the interior of China to the Central Pacific, and from the Aleutian Chain down toward Australia. A defensive perimeter was in place, and essential resources such as oil, rubber, tin, and rice were flowing back to the Japanese homeland. On the surface, everything appeared to be going according to plan. These swift successes, however, bred a dangerous overconfidence within the Japanese military leadership. The ease with which territories had been captured, coupled with the apparent weakness of Allied opposition, reinforced the belief that American industrial power and national resolve had been overstated. Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters began plotting increasingly ambitious campaigns, convinced that the United States lacked both the determination and capacity to mount an effective counterattack. Nevertheless, early indicators of American resilience were emerging. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, though limited in strategic impact, sent a clear message: the United States was willing and capable of projecting power across the Pacific, hinting at the larger. In April 1942, a small group of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, approximately 650 miles from the Japanese coast, and carried out a daring. The material destruction inflicted by this attack was limited, yet its psychological resonance was immense. For the first time, Japan's sacred homeland had been penetrated by enemy bombers, shattering the illusion of invulnerability and signaling that the Japanese defensive perimeter needed to be extended further east. This operation marked a pivotal precursor to the subsequent clash at Midway. Just a month later, in May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea provided another crucial test. While the engagement ended without a clear tactical victor, both sides lost carriers. The broader strategic consequences favored the United States. Japan was forced to abandon its planned assault on Port Moresby in New Guinea, representing the first halt to Japanese expansion since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The battle also demonstrated that American forces, even when numerically inferior, could confront and hold their ground against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The decisive confrontation that would redefine naval power in the Pacific came at Midway from June 4 to June 7, 1942. This engagement exposed fatal errors in Japan's strategic planning and shattered its naval dominance. Admiral Yamamoto had orchestrated the Midway operation with the aim of enticing the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive confrontation. Japanese intelligence, underestimating American capabilities, assumed that the carrier Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was no longer operational. Japanese estimates suggested that only 2 American carriers remained in the Pacific. In reality, shipyard crews at Pearl Harbor had worked around the clock to repair Yorktown, restoring it to service in an astonishing 72 hours. As a result, 3 American carriers faced 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. American codebreakers played a decisive role in the unfolding events. Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had successfully decrypted enough of the Japanese JN-25 naval code to identify Midway as the target of the planned Japanese operation. To verify their suspicions, U.S. intelligence orchestrated a ruse. Midway transmitted a falsified message in clear text, reporting a shortage of fresh water. Soon afterward, Japanese communications referenced the alleged water shortage on AF, confirming the target as Midway. The battle itself unfolded with extraordinary intensity and precision. On the morning of June 4, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched airstrikes against Midway Island. While their aircraft were engaged elsewhere, American torpedo squadrons from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown executed attacks on the Japanese fleet. These torpedo runs were almost entirely destroyed, 41 planes lost, but they drew Japanese fighter cover to low altitude, dispersing the defenders and leaving the decks vulnerable. Seizing this critical moment, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck simultaneously around 10:22 a.m., targeting the 3 carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Within minutes, all 3 were set ablaze and fatally damaged, their flight decks crowded with fueled and armed planes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch retaliatory strikes that severely damaged Yorktown, but by the evening of June 7, Hiryu had also been destroyed by subsequent dive bomber attacks. The aftermath of Midway was catastrophic for Japan. 4 fleet carriers and a cruiser were lost, along with 3,057 personnel, 248 aircraft, and most importantly, roughly 100 veteran pilots and numerous irreplaceable technicians and mechanics. This confrontation irreversibly weakened Japan's offensive naval capabilities, shifting the momentum of the Pacific War decisively in favor of the United States. The losses sustained by the United States at Midway were comparatively limited: 1 aircraft carrier, a single destroyer, roughly 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. Tactically, the battle had an immediate effect, but the broader consequences unfolded over time. Strategically, Midway marked a turning point as Japan forfeited its momentum in the Pacific theater. Beyond the battlefield, the engagement revealed deep-seated flaws in Japan's strategic planning, training rigor, and capacity for industrial mobilization deficiencies that would ultimately prove catastrophic. At the outset of hostilities, Japan commanded 6 full-sized fleet carriers along with 5 smaller carriers. In contrast, the United States entered the conflict in the Pacific with only 3 large carriers. This disparity raised a pivotal question: which nation could replace its losses faster and on a larger scale? The answer would upend Japanese strategic assumptions. American wartime production, unprecedented in scope and consistency, became the backbone of the U.S. military effort. Within a month of the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented Congress with production targets that appeared almost fantastical even to his own advisors: 60,000 aircraft for 1,942, escalating to 125,000 the following year. These goals were not only met but surpassed, reflecting a level of industrial mobilization that had no historical precedent. In the 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards managed to build only 6 carriers. By comparison, American yards produced a staggering 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 light carriers of the Independence class, and numerous escort carriers during the same interval. The Essex-class alone represented an industrial feat beyond Japanese comprehension. Initially, the US Navy planned to construct 32 of these vessels. Although not all were completed before the war's end, 24 were finished, with 14 entering active combat. Displaced 30,000 tons, stretched 870 feet in length, and carried over 90 aircraft. At peak output, American shipyards were launching one such carrier roughly every 6 weeks. In 1944, American factories produced more aircraft in a single year than Japan managed over the entire course of the war. Between 1939 and 1945, USS production reached about 297,000 aircraft compared with Japan's 76,000. The production advantage extended far beyond carriers and airplanes. During the first 4.5 months of 1943 alone, American shipyards delivered more tonnage than Japan had launched in 7 years. The Willow Run facility, operated by Ford Motor Company near Detroit, exemplified the scale. At full capacity, it was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Across every military category, tanks, trucks, artillery, small arms, ammunition, American output dwarfed Japanese output. For instance, the US manufactured 86,000 tanks, whereas Japan produced only about 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. Trucks numbered 2 million in the United States, while Japan managed roughly 165,000. Overall, American production rates surpassed Japanese production by multiples ranging from 5 to 20. Japanese military planners were aware of these figures through intelligence, neutral observers, and the sheer volume of American equipment appearing in theaters of operation. Yet the scale of the disparity induced a psychological block. To fully accept the numbers would be to concede the inevitability of defeat. Rather than recalibrate their strategy, Japanese commanders clung to hope that American output was overstated, that US equipment quality could not match Japanese skill and resolve, or that exceptional tactical actions and sacrifice might reverse the tide. Admiral Yamamoto, however, recognized the reality of American power and never indulged in such illusions. His appreciation of the industrial and military strength of the United States only deepened as the war progressed. Historians continue to question whether Admiral Yamamoto ever actually uttered the words commonly linked to him after the attack on Pearl Harbor. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." No contemporaneous document confirms this statement, and it first appeared publicly in the 1970 film Tora. Nevertheless, the sentiment aligns closely with Yamamoto's documented perspective. In a letter dated January 9, 1942, he expressed a similar notion. A competent military leader gains little honor from striking an enemy caught off guard. Rather, such victories reflect more on the weakness of the defeated than on the strength of the victor. Yamamoto recognized that true strategic prowess would only be revealed when the United States harnessed its full industrial and logistical power. This mobilization accelerated steadily through 1942 and reached its peak by 1943, transforming the US's economic potential into tangible battlefield strength. In the Guadalcanal campaign, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, American forces demonstrated their capacity to maintain prolonged operations over great distances of open ocean. The campaign devolved into a grinding war of attrition, exposing fundamental weaknesses in Japanese military planning, particularly in supply chains, reinforcements, and industrial output. Japan had prepared for rapid, decisive engagements, not extended operations that would exhaust material and human resources. The Japanese merchant fleet, vital for sustaining distant garrisons, suffered increasingly from American submarine attacks. Ship losses exceeded domestic production for years, leaving Japan's maritime logistics in severe decline. By 1943, American submarines were sinking more tonnage than Japanese shipyards could replace. By 1944, Japan's merchant shipping was effectively incapacitated, incapable of transporting essential supplies or extracting resources from occupied territories. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, a primary objective of Japan's war strategy, were consistently disrupted as tankers fell victim to the persistent USI submarine campaign. Similarly, Japan's aircraft industry lagged behind the United States in both quantity and technological advancement. While American factories steadily produced increasingly sophisticated aircraft, Japanese production stagnated. The Mitsubishi A6M0, a revolutionary fighter when introduced in 1940, remained largely unchanged in frontline service throughout the conflict, aside from minor modifications. Meanwhile, USS fighter designs evolved rapidly, progressing from the 4F Wildcat to the F6F Hellcat and ultimately the 4U Corsair, each model offering significant improvements in speed, firepower, and durability. By 1943, American aircraft outclassed Japanese models both in performance and numbers, placing immense pressure on Japanese air units. The disparity extended to pilot training. The United States leveraged its broad educational and training infrastructure to maintain rigorous programs that produced highly skilled aviators capable of flying complex aircraft and executing advanced tactics. Training throughput remained high, ensuring a steady influx of replacement pilots. Japan, constrained by resources and suffering heavy losses, was forced to shorten training durations and lower standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the flight experience of their American counterparts. The combination of superior planes and better-trained pilots led to predictable and escalating Japanese losses in the air, losses they could not sustainably replace. Despite mounting evidence of American industrial and operational superiority, many Japanese commanders clung to cultural ideals rooted in Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, which emphasized valor, perseverance, and honor above all else. The Bushido Code, with its focus on self-sacrifice and death over surrender, reinforced this mindset. While these principles inspired acts of extraordinary courage, they also inhibited pragmatic reassessment of Japan's strategic position. It was not until the summer of 1944, with the fall of the Mariana Islands, that the Japanese High Command could no longer maintain illusions regarding the war's likely outcome. The American invasion of Saipan, which began on June 15, 1944, highlighted the stark gap between Japan's cultural ideals and the harsh reality of the conflict. By this point, Japan's inability to sustain prolonged operations, its faltering industrial base, and the relentless pressure from U.S. dime forces revealed that morale and fighting spirit alone could not counterbalance material deficiencies or strategic disadvantages. American forces, benefiting from overwhelming naval artillery and well-stocked supply lines, gradually forced Japanese defenders into retreat. The combat was intense and merciless, with both Japanese soldiers and civilians often choosing death over surrender. Despite the ferocity of the resistance, the result was never in question. Saipan was captured on July 9, 1944, followed by Tinian on August 1 and Guam by August 10. These victories had profound strategic consequences. The Mariana Islands now provided the United States with air bases capable of hosting B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Japan's carefully prepared defensive perimeter had been breached, exposing its home islands to direct aerial assault. The losses underscored Japan's inability to stop American advances as the USS military's superiority in ships, aircraft, logistics, and trained personnel ensured it could project power across the Pacific at will. The political fallout in Japan was immediate. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into the war, was held responsible for the Mariana disaster and was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, after losing support among the military and political elite. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited a virtually unwinnable situation. Although the strategic balance clearly favored the Allies, surrender was not considered a viable option by Japan's leadership, who clung to the hope of a miraculous turn of events. During the same period, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought between June 19 and 20, 1944, further highlighted the gap in material strength. Japanese naval aviation attempted to strike at American carrier groups but was decimated in what USS pilots famously dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over the course of 2 days, Japan lost roughly 480 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers, including the modern carrier Tiho. US losses were minimal by comparison. Already weakened by sustained attrition, Japanese naval air power never recovered, cementing American control of the skies. The success reinforced the confidence of US commanders who recognized the decisive advantage conferred by their superior resources. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, leading the Southwest Pacific Forces, planned operations assuming ample supplies, abundant ammunition, and constant reinforcements. Japanese forces, conversely, faced dwindling stockpiles, limited ammunition, and no realistic hope for reinforcement. This imbalance was starkly demonstrated during the Philippines campaign, which stretched from October 1944 to July 1945. American troops landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval assembly of the Pacific War to that point. In response, Japan committed nearly its entire remaining fleet to defending the archipelago in the Battle of Leyte Gulf from October 23 to 26, 1944. The engagement, consisting of 4 separate clashes, became the largest naval battle in history. In the Sibuyan Sea, U.S. carrier-based aircraft sank the massive battleship Musashi. At the Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers annihilated a Japanese southern force. Off Sama, a Japanese Central Fleet encountered American escort carriers, but errors in Japanese command prevented a complete victory. Finally, near Cape Engano, U.S. carriers destroyed the remaining Japanese carrier air power. By October 26, organized Japanese naval operations had effectively ended. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of trained sailors. From this point onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer capable of mounting fleet-scale operations. Meanwhile, strategic bombing of Japan escalated throughout 1944 and 1945, directly striking Japanese industrial centers and civilian populations. Emperor Hirohito, who had traditionally maintained a ceremonial role above political and military matters, grew increasingly aware of the nation's dire situation. Regular briefings informed him of Japan's deteriorating position, and by early 1945, he recognized the inevitability of defeat. Nevertheless, the emperor's constitutional limitations, combined with the army's entrenched influence, prevented him from unilaterally ordering surrender. The Japanese state found itself immobilized, caught between the unavoidable reality of defeat and a cultural ethos that made capitulation unacceptable. Japan's last hope for a negotiated settlement was extinguished when the Soviet Union declared war on August 8, 1945. Japanese leaders had previously relied on Moscow's neutrality, hoping to leverage the Soviets as intermediaries with the Western Allies to achieve terms short of unconditional surrender. This strategy was flawed from the start. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had committed to entering the conflict against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat, which occurred on May 8. True to this timeline, the Soviet Union launched its offensive against Japan exactly 90 days later, sweeping into Manchuria with overwhelming force. Japanese forces, weakened and ill-equipped to defend the home islands, were quickly overwhelmed. The Kwantung Army, once considered Japan's elite military formation, collapsed under the Soviet advance. With the Soviet invasion opening a new front, Japan faced enemies on all sides, and any hope of diplomatic maneuvering vanished. Despite this dual catastrophe, surrender did not come immediately. Japanese military leaders, particularly within the army, proposed continuing the conflict, even contemplating a campaign of national sacrifice designed to inflict maximal casualties on any American invasion force in the hope of negotiating better peace terms. This mindset persisted even after the United States deployed atomic weapons. Hiroshima was obliterated on August 6, followed by Nagasaki on August 9, resulting in roughly 130,000 immediate fatalities, with tens of thousands more succumbing later to radiation-related injuries. Nonetheless, hardline army factions insisted that yielding remained dishonorable and unacceptable. Ultimately, it was Emperor Hirohito who broke with precedent and exercised his personal authority to compel Japan's surrender. His intervention overrode the military's staunch resistance and ended the war, marking a decisive moment in both Japanese history and the broader trajectory of World War II. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese population heard the voice of their emperor for the first time through a nationwide radio broadcast. In a carefully measured statement, he refrained from using the word surrender, opting instead to describe the situation of the war as having developed in ways that were not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For a nation that had been consistently told of his military triumphs, the announcement was a profound shock. The reality of defeat, now openly acknowledged, dismantled the propaganda that had maintained morale for years. Following Japan's capitulation, General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, overseeing the occupation and the enormous task of reconstructing a nation devastated by war. The presence of American forces introduced Japanese civilians directly to a level of material prosperity and organizational efficiency that had previously seemed unimaginable. Soldiers arrived equipped with resources, machinery, and logistics capabilities far beyond anything available in Japan, highlighting the stark contrast between the two nations. Japanese military leaders were compelled to confront their miscalculations through post-war interrogations and war crimes trials. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, standing trial for war crimes, admitted that Japan had seriously underestimated the industrial capacity of the United States. In his testimony, he acknowledged, "We did not fully grasp the potential of American production." This rare confession from a man who had steered Japan into conflict illuminated the depth of Japan's strategic misjudgment. Detailed post-war interrogations of Japanese officers revealed that failures went beyond raw intelligence. While Japanese planners had accurate statistics on American industrial output, they lacked a proper understanding of American military doctrine and strategic potential. The Japanese underestimated the logistical prowess of the United States, the capacity to supply and project forces across the Pacific along with its rapid technological innovation. They also misread the underlying philosophy of American warfare, which emphasized material superiority and resource advantage rather than relying solely on courage and fighting spirit. Vice Admiral Tsuichi Nagumo, who had led Japan's carrier forces at Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944, but his surviving staff provided insight into Japan's flawed planning. These testimonies made clear that Japanese intelligence had gathered correct information about production and capabilities, but the critical error lay in interpretation. Commanders knew the figures yet dismissed their strategic implications. Post-war historical analyses conducted by both Japanese and American scholars converged on a central conclusion: Japan's strategy rested on a dangerously optimistic gamble. Japanese leaders had hoped for a swift, decisive war because they recognized that a protracted conflict would be unwinnable. This strategy relied on misjudgments about American resolve. Japanese planners assumed that Americans were indulgent, complacent, and divided, believing that a sudden blow at Pearl Harbor would coerce the United States into accepting Japanese dominance in Asia. In reality, the attack galvanized American society, uniting the population in support of total war. What had once been latent industrial capacity was transformed into unstoppable production. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's ambitious targets, initially considered unrealistic in 1941, were rapidly met as American industry, labor, and agriculture mobilized at unprecedented levels. Women entered factory work in vast numbers, mechanization improved agricultural output, and raw materials were extracted on a massive scale. The American economy expanded at approximately 15% per year during the war, simultaneously supporting military production, civilian needs, and extensive aid to allied nations. In contrast, Japan faced stark limitations. Its smaller economy struggled under severe constraints, compounded by the destruction of shipping routes due to American submarine campaigns that cut off essential imports from occupied territories. Strategic bombing further decimated urban centers and industrial capacity. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had dwindled to around 150 planes per month, compared with over 8,000 per month in the United States. Soldiers faced chronic shortages of ammunition, while American forces enjoyed a surplus. civilians endured famine, whereas American servicemen had abundant food. Decades later, many former Japanese officers reflected candidly on their errors. Admiral Somu Toyoda, the last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had embarked on a war it could not have won from the outset. Memoirs and interviews consistently highlighted the same themes: Japan's underestimation of American industrial and logistical power, the failure to comprehend the United States' strategic approach, and the mistaken belief that a single surprise strike could coerce a powerful, united nation. These analyses cement the understanding that Japan's defeat was as much the result of strategic misjudgment as battlefield losses. During the early years of the Pacific War, Japan recognized, at least intellectually, the technical and material superiority of the United States. However, this understanding did not translate into a deep emotional or strategic awareness of its consequences. There was a pervasive belief among Japanese leaders and military officers that determination, willpower, or spirit could compensate for material shortcomings. This conviction, in retrospect, was a fundamental misjudgment. Mitsumasa Yonai, who held the positions of Prime Minister and Navy Minister at different points during the war, later informed USS interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had repeatedly warned civilian authorities that any war with the United States would be unwinnable. These warnings, however, were largely disregarded by the army, which dominated policy-making in the Japanese government at the time. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, documented extensively after the conflict the steady decline in the quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft. In his 1957 autobiography Samurai, Sakai recounted how newly trained pilots, often with extremely limited flight experience, were sent directly into combat and were almost invariably destroyed. These inexperienced aviators were effectively given no chance to survive or succeed. By 1944, even veteran pilots like Sakai were painfully aware of the inevitable trajectory of defeat. They observed the steady improvement and increasing numbers of American aircraft while Japanese technology stagnated and production fell. Yet, due to military and social pressures, Japanese forces continued to fight. The undeniable proof of Japan's industrial and material inferiority became clear only after the war, through the detailed research conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The results painted a stark picture. Throughout the war, the United States accounted for roughly two-thirds of all Allied military equipment. American shipyards produced over 5,000 vessels, not only replacing all losses suffered to Axis attacks, but also expanding fleet capacity beyond pre-war levels. In stark contrast, Japan's production could not match these demands. Only 6 aircraft carriers were built after the Battle of Midway, compared to 122 carriers of all types produced by the US. Over the course of the war, total aircraft production in Japan amounted to approximately 76,000 units, while America manufactured nearly 300,000. Truck production in Japan reached about 165,000 vehicles. In the United States, 2 million trucks were constructed. Across all sectors, steel, oil refining, aluminum, electronics, and more, American industrial output consistently outpaced Japan's by factors ranging from 10 to 20. The human toll of these miscalculations was catastrophic. Roughly 2.8 million Japanese military personnel perished during the conflict. Civilian casualties caused by bombings, starvation, and other war-related effects ranged between 500,000 and 1 million. These losses occurred in a war that Japan had knowingly initiated despite clear evidence that victory was impossible. Recognition of this reality came at different moments for different Japanese leaders. Figures like Admiral Yamamoto understood the danger from the outset, while others clung to illusions of potential success until pivotal defeats such as the fall of Saipan, or until the destruction wrought by the atomic bombs shattered their illusions. Regardless of timing, the ultimate truth that Japan was confronting a foe whose material and industrial capacity far exceeded its own was unavoidable. In the post-war decades, as Japan recovered and emerged as the world's second-largest economy by the 1982, the lessons of 1945 deeply economic and industrial achievement through trade and technological development replaced the pursuit of territorial conquest. What the Japanese High Command had once sought to seize through force was ultimately accomplished more sustainably through peaceful enterprise. The story of Japan's failure to appreciate America's industrial power serves as a cautionary example of the dangers of strategic denial. Data was available, warnings were issued, and evidence was accumulating. Yet bureaucratic momentum, cultural biases, and political constraints prevented rational reassessment until defeat became unavoidable. Individual Japanese officers came to this realization in different ways. Some witnessed overwhelming waves of American aircraft. Others noted the steady flow of supplies sustaining U.S. operations. Some confronted the stark contrast between the suffering of Japanese troops and the abundance available to American prisoners, while others understood only when cities were annihilated by B-29 bombings. American industrial capacity was a tangible reality, not propaganda or exaggeration, and it decisively shaped the war's outcome long before the final battles. The sleeping giant that Japan awakened possessed a level of productive power far beyond Japan's ability to counter. Long before Pearl Harbor, the mathematics of defeat was evident in production statistics, yet Japanese planners chose to ignore these figures until the evidence could no longer be disputed. That decision, the refusal to acknowledge reality, led directly to the destruction of Imperial Japan and the deaths of millions. The consequences of this strategic self-deception, realized in full by August 1945, stand as one of history's clearest illustrations of how industrial capacity determines military outcomes.